Just one question. What if you miss?
I won't.
Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to Boundary Break, the show where we basically take a camera anywhere we want to try and find secrets and discoveries in some of our favorite games. I'm your co-host, Snipey, and today we're covering one of my favorite games ever, Halo 2. But before we jump into the video fully, I wanted to give a massive thank you to General Heed, who pretty much made this video possible by teaching me some of Halo 2's official mod tools functionality. So if you're feeling generous, head over to his channel and give him some love. So one of the perks of this build of the game being a debug build and allowing me to use mod tools is that while it does have basic camera functionality, although it is lacking compared to other cameras that I've used, it does have a lot of debug functionality, and that means I can play the game, if I really wanted to, from a third-person perspective or from another character's perspective, which, trust me, does get weird. But something that's not weird, because we've seen it in CE, so why not again, Master Chief's face is also his helmet. So when he puts his helmet on in the intro cutscene, he puts on a second helmet. Not much else to it.
Tell that to the Covenant.
So the way Halo 2 works is that even though a cutscene is playing, the player character has to be stored somewhere. Usually it's stored around a corner to not be seen during the cutscene itself. Sometimes even in a separate room entirely. But the player character is whatever character will be assumed at the end of the cutscene. And so even in the intro cutscene, when we're not quite at Cairo Station yet, Master Chief is living it big on High Charity and stored up in the stands. So similar to pretty much every other game using real-time cutscenes, this is where we can see the most visible shortcuts, since it takes a ton of effort and fandangling to get these cutscenes to work in general, and there's not a ton of reason to be messing with stuff that you'll not be seeing anyway, so anything off camera doesn't matter. Take that as an animator's note, if you please. This, in general, can lead to a lot of fun stuff to look at, like how if there's ever a shot where it's just the character's upper torso, those legs are not moving, and sometimes those legs are backwards, as in not facing the right way. But that's all off camera. What about what they pull off in camera using perspective trickery? Well, that's where stuff can get a lot more complicated. Rather than just an element being left in its natural state of not being moved, you're now having to force stuff to actually work inside the camera's view, wherever they decide to put it, right? Well, sometimes this can lead it to look better with characters floating off the ground. Surprisingly, a lot of the time, actually. And so, in a ton of cutscenes, characters will be floating above or submerged in the floor. And so quite often, you can kind of imagine the floor being more of a guide rather than a steadfast rule. This can be done really well and sometimes not quite. And depending on the camera angle, characters can get really high off the ground. Usually if they're looking at something large and over a structure, and to avoid having the character needing to crank their neck 90 degrees for an over-the-shoulder shot, they'll just put them really high up into the air. I'm basically just speaking about the one cutscene, but I've seen it happen in a couple. Another perspective trick they pull is making stationary objects in camera look like they're moving. As you can see in this shot, this segment of ground that is below these little pods is actually the thing moving up towards them, rather than the pods moving down towards the ground. And with the default camera perspective, there would be no way to tell the difference. If you've never heard of HelloFresh before, I've got a surprise for you. They're the sponsor of today's episode, and they're ready to give you guys the opportunity to have step-by-step recipes that maximize convenience in the kitchen and will have you enjoying your food in just 30 minutes or less. HelloFresh is all about making the joys of cooking just a bit simpler, with tons of different offerings like veggie, pescatarian, fit, and wholesome meals that cater to what you want to eat. And my favorite part of HelloFresh is that I get to cook more delicious meals without any of the worry of not having what I need on hand. And with pre-proportioned ingredients, you can rest easy knowing that none of that food is going to waste. Use my link or go to HelloFresh.com and use code POGSHESAYSEPT65 for 65% off plus free shipping on your first box. Once you click, my description will live update to count up the purchases, so you can know how many other people signed up along with you. So what are you waiting for? Go eat some food, and thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video. personally for me, cutscenes are one of my favorite things to look at because they seem so tightly woven, so tightly crafted, right? And they really are if you think about it. They're perfectly timed to the frame to make sure you don't see any of this happening. And sometimes these can be really simple things, like when Mercy has this flood form pulled off of him. He doesn't really. It stays on him for most of the cutscene, with the one that Master Chief pulls into frame being one that's loaded in off screen. But sometimes in order to get some of these shots, they do weird things that don't really make any sense to me. In particular, in the Delta Halo cutscene, before you're actually dropped down in those pods I talked about earlier, you have the pretty generic characters conversing, and some stuff we'll get to later down the line. But first, let's take a moment to note that Master Chief and Johnson are both stored in their own separate pods. And this stays pretty consistent throughout the cutscene, except for one quick cut where Master Chief replaces Johnson in his pod, which is then quickly replaced with a fade-out transition which puts Johnson right back. So I'm wondering what necessitated this swap, and whether it's a patchwork job or an intentional transition to sort of have this match cut movement. Anyway, I do want to mention something that I personally find really cool. And that's that everything in a cutscene is happening in one map. Even if it does transition between different map geometries, all of it's happening in the one scene. It never transitions to another scene if the area is swapped out. Usually it will just deload part of a level and then reload part of a level just real quick. But they don't always have to do that. Some cutscenes have their own special tricks in order to keep everything in one level at all times. Namely, the intro cutscene to the level Outskirts, where at the beginning of the cutscene, it's this large city landscape that the Pelicans are flying over and kind of towards the entire time. And then it swaps to this really cramped street. Well, this street is just above the city map at all times. And in an even more efficient use of the street, it's the only street that's used in this cutscene. And this cutscene goes on for quite a while, so you're probably thinking, what? What do you mean it's just the one street? But it is, and the Pelicans are constantly teleporting back to the start over and over and over again. And one of the more common things that will occur is these reaction shots, where really quick a character will show up on screen to say a thing or two, and then they're gone. Well, when this happens, they're usually loaded into a separate area of the level. This is a similar story with screen renders, where a character will be on a tiny little monitor in another character's scene. This is done through secondary cameras, and all of it's happening live, which is a trick that you can see in a lot of other games. And all of this leads into the first viewer request of the episode, which is, where does the final Master Chief cutscene take place compared to the rest of the level? And the answer is, well, right here, literally on the outside edge of where everything else is, which yes, includes the Scarab, which is still there. But yeah, basically they just have the rest of the level deload its geometry, and then they swap out the skybox from a normal sky to one filled with stars. There's actually a lot of viewer requests for this episode, and one was to give a zoom out of the map that I was just showing off, so let's do that. We also have a viewer request to look at the Cairo Station exterior, and there's actually quite a bit to see here, since this is a really big set piece map. Basically, the entire station is designed as a gun, and so there was a surprising amount of care and detail put into how this gun would function. There's this really detailed firing animation that pretty much involves the entire exterior of the station moving. And even then, on the interior, there is a loading mechanism that is synced up to this exterior animation. This does include a bullet thing, which, fun Halo trivia thing, is apparently supposed to be a 3,000-ton ferric tungsten round that gets fired at 4% the speed of light, so the more you know, I guess. That gets fed into the cannon and then is stuck in the ceiling until it gets reloaded. Also, on the bottom of the station, there's an exhaust of some kind, which I had never seen prior to making this episode, so you probably haven't seen it either. On the outside of the station, there are two ports for ships to dock, and in one of them, which many of you have probably seen because you go through this area, is the In Amber Clad, which is a frigate that gets featured throughout the entire game. And while most of you have probably seen it, I imagine not a lot of you have tried jumping onto it, or maybe you have, but anyway, you can jump onto the In Amber Clad and walk around the entire thing. The out of bounds of Halo 2 are really not that restrictive at all. in most cases. But this is by far one of the easiest out-of-bounds experiences in the entire game, since it's just a simple jump to get out. And some of you may have wondered what happens to this giant Covenant ship that flies right by the station, and the truth is, as it gets closer to the planet, it just starts shrinking in size until it becomes nothing, to give off the illusion of it going to the planet's surface. Also, a strange detail is that the other stations are flat images, all the way up until they explode, and then they become 3D debris. There's a scene of a warthog trying to escape from a Scarab, and it drives into a tunnel, and then is very promptly shot. And one of the viewer requests that we had for this episode was to see where the Scarab actually comes into play during this sequence, when it loads in and when it despawns. And so I got a few different angles that show off how this scene is playing out. The next viewer request was to look at the underwater elevator scene, which unfortunately we don't have a lot to look at. Number one, it's really dark, and number two, there's not a lot of stuff going on down here. But I hope this fish, which is made 3D by having two images sort of bent together in a weird way that doesn't connect, mends the break in your heart. Whoever asked for this underwater section, I am so sorry. The part once you're past the elevator though is pretty cool. And the hallways and rooms are actually quite expansive, even if this 2D texture at the ends of the hallways kind of overextends itself a little bit. Another one of the viewer requests that I had was to look at the Gravemind cutscene and the room that it takes place in. And there's quite a bit to talk about in this room. The Gravemind is huge, by the way. And taking the camera around, we can get a better sense of his actual scale. Also, his tentacles aren't directly connected to him, or really anything, and so they jump around the room quite a bit, often having their positions completely shifted depending on the camera. And the model of the Prophet of Regret being merged with a tentacle has a couple fun additions to it, namely skulls, quite a few of them, with his other arm being completely disconnected from the rest of his body. One of the viewer requests that I had for this episode was getting the Covenant perspective of being kicked out of a vehicle by the Master Chief, and so I must oblige. And to close out the viewer requests, I'm going to do zoom outs of a couple multiplayer maps. Also, have you ever wondered what Ascension looks like without fog? Well, you're in luck, because it looks like this. The rocks don't go very far down. The fog sells the entire map. You should really keep the fog on, honestly. So this happens a couple times in the game, but there's ambient gunfire that will happen at a specific trigger. Say you're walking into the hotel hallway, and then at the end of the hallway, there's the plasma rifle fire that hits the wall. Well, that's done by making a floating gun that fires the bullets, rather than having a character off-screen do it. This gets reused in a couple levels, like the one near the end of the game where you're playing as the Arbiter, where there's meant to be a battle happening between the brutes and the elites. So this one actually swaps between multiple weapons doing the shooting. And then there's one example that you might not expect, where in the Metropolis level, the Scarab fires around a corner and then walks around. Well, the Scarab isn't there until it goes to walk around the corner, and so that first Scarab blast is from a tiny plasma rifle firing a Scarab cannon. A Scarab gun, if you will. Similar to the attention to detail that you can find in the level Cairo Station, the level The Arbiter has a ton of stuff going on just on the station itself. It's designed as this automated gas mine, and so you have these 3 tubes extracting gas from the planet, though apparently only 2 of them work. And then there's this huge animated skybox to represent a storm on a gas giant. And because of the way that this is designed, we can see pretty much the entire level folded out in front of us from this starting area, except for the cable section, which is its own unique area that gets loaded in later, though we can see the cable from this starting area. And it goes pretty high, though not forever. On On the inside of the station, we can see echoes of this with the automated elevator system that's constantly pulling out these crates of stuff. And this elevator is animated the entire way down. And with the camera pulled in close, we can see how this thing extracts those cases from the wall, where they just spawn in rather than being actually removed. In this section, you're also attacked by Flood, and surprisingly, the Flood have a climbing animation, which I have slowed down for you to watch. And in this level, we have our first dev cube, just below the map when you're about to cut all the cables. And while these dev cubes can be used for pretty much anything, I have a pretty good guess for what this one's for. Since when you cut the attachments for the cable, the entire level tilts more aggressively each time. So I think this cube might be handling the rotation of the level. And when you cut the cable, you may be wondering what happens. And so what happens is, it loads in an entirely new animated skybox that is animated as falling, and then the entire ceiling disconnects and flies up into the air. Also, for this boss fight with the heretic, inside the ship there is another cube, though this one, instead of being black, is a silver color, and I don't even have an idea for what this would be for. As I mentioned before, sometimes the entire map can be laid out in front of you entirely in one go, even if that map separates into multiple different levels. And we can see this with levels like Delta Halo, where the later parts of the level are laid out in a path, and as you move through, the areas behind you become those lower detailed areas. Think of them as placeholders to give a sense of scale. And while these areas don't always 100% line up, they do give you a pretty good idea of where everything is in the level. And then this follows into the next mission, which just follows the same path as the one before it, moving further along into the map. And then an uprising, where the entire path of the level is a straightforward shot and leads into the next. And then the next level using this map won't happen until another level plays first. And in the last level of the game, there's this part where Johnson jumps into and takes control of a Scarab. And you may have been wondering what happens to him when he walks inside, but he kind of just waltzes into the center and stands there for a bit, until the cutscene plays, and then Johnson is despawned. The layout of High Charity is massive in scale, by the way. Every element of this Covenant city is as massive as it can be, to the outside towers, to some of the stuff on the towers, to the elevators, the interior buildings like the Mausoleum of the Arbiter and a whole bunch of the other areas, even the length of this energy beam, which is just surprisingly long. Also, it's time for one of my favorite parts of the episode, and one I didn't think would actually happen. We get to look at some low-poly birds. And I mean, that's what all this is for, actually. Just in case you didn't know, this entire episode was an excuse to look at some low-poly birds. But also, we have a special guest. Low-poly dinosaur thing, which is modeled with a ton of holes. And I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a dinosaur, but it definitely looks like one. We can also take a look at a low-poly High Council member and compare it directly to a higher poly version that you come across later in the game. By the way, the grunts do have a face rendered underneath their gas masks, which might surprise you, but this is because they share their model with the heretic grunts, which just have a clamp-down gas mask, so they can have their mouths out. And faces across the board can get kind of strange. You have the Arbiter's face compared to other elites, where he actually has a full set of eyes, rather than just 2D textures, I believe because the player is meant to relate more to him. And in case you didn't know, on Arbiter's shoulder armor, there's an engraving of a Sangheili face, which only makes an appearance in this game. We also have the Jetpack Elite, who, despite wearing a mask over their face, still have their eyes underneath the goggles. Taking a look inside the Marine's face, we can see that they're more traditionally rendered, with little half-spheres for eyes and a cavity for their mouth, though their teeth are just 2D textures. But what about a character without a traditional face? Well, that would be the drones, and while their entire body is kind of weird, and we'll get to that in a second, their eyes are these little tiny emissive spheres that are rendered behind the skybox. Anyway, their wings, in case you ever wanted to know where they come from, well, they're where you think, except the way that it works is that their wings get bigger and smaller, rather than them being full size underneath the model at all times. Sentinels are a fun look too because they're not organic creatures, they're machines. And so they have some interesting design choices, like a floating eye that's not connected to the rest of the body, and an idle pose that has them at rest with all their parts compressed together in a single object. A more organic creature, though, would be the Flood, which have multiple different iterations across the game, and real quick I'll show you a close-up of some of the different versions, like the Elite and the Human one, which is slightly grotesque due to the fact that its eyes have rolled to the back of its head, along with many other things. But the standard little infection form has some weird details on it, like I think it's supposed to have hair, which kind of looks disgusting. And then there's the carrier form, which has a lot in common with these little flood nubs that you find in the laboratory. A fun detail that you can find on all of the human weapons is that they have their own decals on them, whether that's the famous rocket launcher hold like this, to some of the weapons having symbols of other languages on them, like the battle rifle having 2 Chinese symbols that mean Monkey King. There's also these symbols on the pistol, which also has its place of manufacture and ammunition type on the side, or just generic symbols like on the sniper rifle, or some of the generic markings that you'd find on the shotgun or the SMG. And because I can pause the game, I can actually take a look at the projectiles that are coming from some of these weapons, except for the tank, which doesn't actually fire anything except for a line. The fuel rod, though, does actually fire something, though it's this tiny crystal thing that's really hard to see. One of the cooler projectiles, though, that's fully modeled and detailed is the rocket projectile, which has fins and stickers all over the dang thing. Also, to finish out this video, I have a category of clips that I just titled Weirdness, but these are just things that I wanted to talk about that I couldn't really fit anywhere else. So when a character with shields takes damage, there's this effect that happens where their shield kind of expands and then is depleted. And on the Heretic Elite, you can kind of see how this works, because their body is comprised of a lot of individual faces. And I believe that that's how this works. I think it's the separate faces all have their own individual shield element that expands off of the model. And so you can see a lot of different places where they don't connect anymore because they've expanded. Also, because I'd feel bad if I didn't mention it, normal elites have this orange light on their armor that indicates when their shields are active, which is turned off when their shields are down. Fun fact. If there's a room with a whole bunch of weapons inside it and you haven't entered it yet, and you take the camera inside, something that you'll see, which is kind of funny, is that all of the weapons are stored vertically in the environment. And so until you walk in the room, they're all standing up on end. If you've ever wondered where Halo 2's actual camera perspective is from, you'll be happy to know that it's up in the left shoulder somewhere, rather than Master Chief's face. This is pretty common in most FPS games where the camera that is rendering the game is not actually in the character's head. It's usually somewhere in the chest or shoulder area. Here's a peek at what it looks like when NPCs are spawned out of a Phantom. You'll notice that they're all stored airborne just away from the grav lift, and then they're pushed into the hull, and then they fall down to the ground. But until then, they're all merged together floating. So the heavier vehicles like the Scorpion and the Wraith have whatever character that jumped into them completely disappear. But as you know, for a lot of other vehicles, that's not the case. And for the Banshee in particular, you can see the little feet dangling out, but you can't really see what happened to the top half of the body. And so here's what that looks like from both Arbiter's perspective, which looks uncomfortable, and a Spartan's perspective, which also looks uncomfortable. They're both kind of just crammed in there. Also, did anybody else know that the Hunter's arms had completely different sizes? The one with the cannon is surprisingly small, with the left arm carrying the shield being more what I figured both of them would look like, but no. Also, these pistons you can find in Sacred Icon are absolutely massive and extend way up into the ceiling. There's a couple of scripted fights throughout the game, one of which being these Marines against the Flood. And while they will die no matter what, they will lose this fight eventually even if you sit really far away. But at the beginning of the game in Cairo Station, the gunnery sergeant in the armory is firing at some elites. This fight does not have an unscheduled conclusion. It will only end when the player gets close. And so neither the elites nor the sergeant can die until that point, meaning the only true way to keep the gunnery sergeant alive is to let him fight rather than trying to help. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this Halo 2 video. I apologize if you hear any of that in the background. My birds are really excited today. They were really excited for this episode, much like I am. But yeah, again, massive thank you to General Heed. Basically showed me how to do any of this, and I really appreciate it. Also, if you didn't see last week's episode on The Witcher 3, feel free to head over there, give it a watch. I don't know how many people it actually got pushed out to, but it'd mean a lot to me. Anyway, hope you had a fantastic day, whatever day you watch this. I will see you guys in the next one. Well, the one after the next one, you know. Alright, see ya.